next 10-15 minutes on understanding the evolution of taxation of partnership firm and a partner. The Income Tax Act, as you know, for the first time was codified in 1886. And thereafter came the Income Tax Act of 1918, which had a short life of 4 years only. So we can start the codified law, a detailed law on income tax legislation, to be that of 1922. When the Income Tax Act of 1922 was introduced, capital gains was not subject to levy at that time. The reason being, and the reason stands today as well, the charging section in the Income Tax Act, even today as well, provides for a levy of income tax on the total income of a resident in relation to on the income which is derived from a source. What is subject to tax under Section 5 of the Income Tax Act is all income from whatever source derived. If for any reason the income is not derived from a source, courts have held that there cannot be any levy of Income Tax Act. For example, gift is not derived from a source and therefore cannot be liable to tax. Sale of land has been held by the Patna High Court in 1939 in 7 ITR to say is not derived from a source. Source is generally understood to mean something which gives you a regular income or which has a definite means of giving the income. When you sell an asset, it is not the source. The source itself is lost per se. And therefore, courts have held that you cannot subject gains derived from transfer of an asset to tax under Section 5 in the absence of a source. We colloquially use the phrase capital receipt and not liable to tax. The actual legal terminology that is to be used in such terms is not capital receipt, but income which does not have a source. Income without a source would be the more appropriate phrase to refer to a capital receipt. So this was the position prior to 1947 in India. But if we look at the jurisprudence across other countries, for example, in Australia and US, the taxation laws of Australia and US provided for levy of tax on all incomes. They did not have a qualification like we had in India that income would be taxable only if it is derived from a source. Therefore, even in the early 1900s, courts in US as well as in Australia have held capital gains were liable to tax under the domestic laws of those states. Deriving clue from the taxation laws of US as the objects and reasons for the 1947 Finance Act says, Section 12B of the Income Tax Act 1922 was introduced in 1947. Broadly, the scheme stated that if there is transfer of a capital asset, then the gains derived from the transfer will be liable to tax. The gains derived from that transfer shall be computed by reducing from the consideration the cost incurred in acquiring the asset. So the primary conditions for subjecting an income to tax was that there should be a capital asset. The capital asset should be transferred and the computation mechanism should work. If for any reason one of these criteria is missing, then the levy would fail. Why does the levy fail? Because of the reasons as it stood before 1947. Constitutional validity for this amendment was challenged before the Supreme Court in the case of Naveen Chandra Mafatlal. Those days, we did not have the constitution. Therefore, there was no provision for filing a writ. All the constitutional challenges came through appeal only. In Naveen Chandra Mafatlal's case, a assessing officer passed an assessment order saying that he was liable to capital gain tax. In appeal, they challenged validity of the section to be contrary to the Government of India Act of 1935. And the appeal failed. The court held that capital gain is in fact income as held by courts in US and UK. Earlier, the Income Tax Act did not state capital gain to be a source. By an amendment to Section 14 of the Income Tax Act 1961 as it stands today, capital gain also has been included as a source, and therefore the levy was valid, was what the Supreme Court stated in Naveen Chandra Mahitra. Interestingly, I'm not sure of the reason. The introduction of Section 12B in 1947 was withdrawn in 1948. The section as it introduced was present in the legislation only for 1 year. After the Supreme Court upheld the constitutional validity in 1954, the section was reintroduced in 1957. Once the section was reintroduced in 1957, dispute arose as to whether a partner and a firm can be liable to tax, amongst all other issues. This is a summary of positions that the Supreme Court has observed. I'll slightly take 5 minutes in explaining this in a bit detail. In 1957, when the legislation said gains from transfer of a capital asset should be liable to tax, a dispute arose as to when a company liquidates, is there a transfer of capital asset from the company to the shareholder in the ordinary meaning of the word transfer? The Supreme Court held that when a company liquidates, there is no liability to tax in the hands of the shareholder because there was no transfer. Law was amended in 1961 to specifically say when there is liquidation of a company, there will be liability to capital gain tax in the hands of the shareholder. This is the fundamental principle that we will have to appreciate. That is, when a body created by a statute or an artificial person comes to an end and liquidates, any transmission of assets from that body or the artificial person to the stakeholder is ordinarily not recorded as transfer. The reason being, the shareholder had rights in the assets already, but the rights fructified when the company liquidated. So, for example, if I hold shares in Reliance Industries, indirectly, I hold some interest in the Jamnagar factory of Reliance Industries. But the right fructifies on the event of liquidation. So on liquidation, as observed by the Supreme Court, nothing happens, but the right is converted in from one form to another. That cannot be regarded as a transfer in the ordinary meaning of the word. That formed the basic judgment or principle from which everything flowed. Then the 1961 Act, as introduced, specifically provided that gains arising from liquidation of a company shall be liable to tax. So the judgment that I was referring to was of Madurai Mills in the case of a company. Then the first judgment in the context of partnership firm arose in the often discussed case of Sunil Siddharth. A partner and an individual, when he became a partner in a firm, introduced his personal asset as capital of the firm. Question arose as to whether in the hands of the partner there will be any capital gain tax. The assessing officer, interestingly, treated that the individual has transferred his asset to the firm and the consideration on the transfer is equal to the amount recorded in the books of the firm as capital of this individual Sunil Siddharth Bhai. The Gujarat High Court, in a challenge to such an order, held that there is no transfer per se from the individual to the partner, and in any case, there is no consideration flowing to this individual, and therefore struck down the assessment order, saying that there can be no capital gain tax in the case. When the SLP went to the Supreme Court held that when a partner introduces capital into the firm, there is in fact a transfer, but there is no consideration flowing to the individual, and therefore the levy would fail. This is the judgment in the context of taxability of a partner or introduction of capital into the firm. Now, coming to retirement of a partner, either in the form of dissolution of the firm as a whole, but retirement of only one of the partners, there can be tax liability in the hands of two persons, retiring partner or the firm. When looked at from the perspective of the retiring partner, the Supreme Court in Mohanbai Phamabai held that when a retiring partners gets any asset or cash from the partnership firm or from any other continuing partner upon retiring from the firm, he has not transferred any asset. The Supreme Court held in the hands of the retiring partner, there always existed rights in the assets of the firm. When he retired, these rights got settled. And therefore, there cannot be any capital gain tax, is what the Supreme Court held in Mohanbai Phamabhai. And for holding so, they followed the judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Madurai Mills, which was rendered in the context of liquidation of a company as the law stood prior to 1961. Then the question came before the Supreme Court in the case of Malabar Fisheries as to whether upon dissolution of a firm, that is when the firm transfers some assets from its books to the partner's personal asset, can there be liability to tax in the hands of the partnership firm? Again, the Supreme Court held there cannot be any tax liability in the hands of the firm when it distributes assets, because what the firm does is settle the rights amongst the partners by transmitting the assets that it holds to the partner. The Supreme Court held in Malabar Fisheries that this transaction of handing over the assets of the firm to the partner cannot be regarded as transfer in the ordinary meaning of the word transfer, and also in the expanded meaning of the word transfer in section 247 of the Income Tax Act. All these are very crucial and relevant, because if in the law today, as it stands today, section 9b and section 55(4), for any reason a transaction comes out of the deeming fiction created therein, the principles as it stood prior to 1987 would revive and would have to be applied in facts of the case. So it is very important for us to understand the position of law as it stood before 1987. The law was extensively amended then in 1987. Broadly, the amendments were twofold. To overcome the judgment in Sunil Siddharth Bhai, that is when a partner introduces capital into a firm, the Act was amended to say that the amount which is recorded as capital balance in the books of the firm would be deemed to be the consideration. That is what the assessing officer did in the case of Sunil Siddharth Bhai, what brought in as a legislation by incorporating section 45(3). There was no law or no levy which was incorporated when the partner introduces cash into the firm. The definition of transfer was not amended because in Sunil Siddharth Bhai, Supreme Court itself said that introduction of capital by a partner into the firm will be regarded as transfer. Therefore, they did not feel the necessity to amend the definition of transfer. This is the first leg of amendment they brought. We saw a few minutes back, the Supreme Court in Malabar Fisheries held when there is dissolution of a firm or retirement of a firm, there was no tax liability in the hands of the partnership firm. To overcome this, section 45(4) was introduced to say, not the 45(4) as it stands today, the 45(4) as it stood before the amendment by Finance Act 2021, which broadly stated withdrawal of capital asset by a partner on the liquidation of the firm or otherwise will result in tax liability in the hands of the partnership firm. This amendment was brought in to overcome the judgment of the Supreme Court in Malabar Fishery. Interestingly, no amendment was brought in to overcome the judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Mohanbai Phamabhai. If we go back a bit, in Mohanbai Phamabhai, the Supreme Court held when there is retirement of partner from a firm, there is no tax liability in the hands of the partner because he does not transfer any capital asset. This judgment was not sought to be overruled by the legislation when it extensively overhauled taxation of partnership firm in 1987. Having seen these amendments, a number of disputes arose in taxation of partners and firm after 1987, as the law stood before, after 1987. till 2020. Briefly explaining the controversies that arose. First set of disputes which we have seen in the past is when Section 45(4) provided for taxation on dissolution of a firm or otherwise, will it cover retirement of a partner from the firm? That is, whether withdrawal of capital by a partner on his retirement be covered within the ambit of Section 45(4), because the section uses the word dissolution of the firm. Justice Rebello of the Bombay High Court in the case of A.N. Nayak held, it will in fact be covered in the definition of 45(4) because of usage of the phrase dissolution or otherwise. One other argument taken by the assessee before the Bombay High Court was the 1987 amendment introduced Section 45(4) but did not amend the definition relating to transfer. Therefore, when a firm transfers an asset, when a firm hands over an asset to the partner on his retirement, it cannot be regarded as a transfer. Justice Rebello, in my view, correctly held the word transfer is an inclusive term. When Section 45(4) is specifically introduced, you cannot read that section in a manner to leave it redundant by saying the definition of the word transfer is not amended, and therefore held Section 45(4) would cover a case of retirement as well. Contrary view has been taken by the Madras High Court in the case of National Company recently. The reasoning given by the Madras High Court, in my humble opinion, is incorrect. They follow a judgment of another subsequent judgment of Justice Chandrachud in Bombay High Court, which did not, in effect, overrule A.N. Nayak, but gave relief to assessee on some other point. There's first set of controversy that happened. The second set of controversy was whether Section 45(4) would apply only to receipt of capital asset by a partner on his retirement or dissolution of a firm, or would it apply even in relation to withdrawal of cash by the partner on his retirement. In other words, when a partner introduces 1 lakh rupees into the firm and retires by withdrawing 1 crore rupees, either in the form of goodwill or revaluation of asset, will there be tax liability in the hands of the partner? A full bench of the Karnataka High Court held in 2013 that 45(4) would cover only transfer of capital asset. But over the period of time, there have been judgments to the contrary as well. The recent judgment of the Bangalore Tribunal in the case of Savita Khadur is an example, where they say even withdrawal of cash by the partner on their retirement will be liable to tax under 45(1) or under 45(4). Apart from all this, the legislature also noted that assessees have been using partnership firm and the lacuna in the law as a mean to evade tax. For example, when a partnership firm owned say a piece of land, and the partner and the firm wants to sell the land and derive profits out of it. Once such the land is sold and profits are earned, there will be liability tax. Instead of selling the land, people were using a mechanism of asking the buyer to introduce capital into the firm, and the old partners retiring from the partnership after withdrawing the capital introduced by the new partners. Thereby, effectively, the land is transferred to the new buyer, and the old partners retire from the firm without paying any tax. Bombay High Court, I think it is Justice Kapadia then, in the case of Nayanthara Agarwal, held such transactions are nothing but a sham. Therefore, do not take protection under Section 45(4) or 45(1), and held the transaction to be taxable under 45(1). So these sorts of tax effective measures were also noted by the legislature and the courts.